Hey there. Ever wondered what death really looked like in the Middle Ages? Not the noble kind they show in movies. No heroic last words. No warriors fading into sunsets. No, the real thing was messier, louder, crueler. Screams lost in the crowd, blood mixing with mud, and justice that often looked more like vengeance. Tonight's story gives you just a small glimpse, but it's chilling enough. We're going back to the year 1302, to the damp marshlands of Audomarois. There, a man named Simon Hannabaert became a symbol of fear, not because he was a monster, but because of how society chose to treat those who didn't quite fit. One sentence, one execution. And if you listen closely, you'll see that medieval justice wasn't justice at all. If stories like this catch your interest, even just a little, feel free to hit like or subscribe. Only if you're genuinely into what we're doing here. Also, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it on your end? Now, go ahead, dim the lights, turn on a fan, and lean back. Because Simon Hannabaert's nightmare is just beginning. It began with a sound, not a scream, not yet, but the slow, methodical clink of metal against wood. Someone was preparing the wheel. Not a carriage wheel, not anymore. It had been repurposed, reimagined by the cruelest imagination of medieval justice into something far more sinister. It was no longer for travel. It was for torment. Now let's set the scene. You're lying in bed, maybe nestled under the weight of a blanket, listening to this in the dark. Maybe there's rain tapping the window. You're relaxed, distant from the world outside. But imagine, just for a moment, that you weren't here. Imagine you were born in 13th century Audomarois, in the thick of northern France, just as the kingdom is tightening its grip on rebellious Flanders. Imagine justice wasn't a concept, but a performance. And the final act, your body, broken in public view, bones shattered like firewood, a message carved into you, for others to see. The story of Simon Hannabaert is not bedtime friendly, but here we are. This is the kind of tale that turns a medieval market square into an amphitheater of horror, where a man's final screams compete with the cheers, or silence, of the crowd. It's a story of a farmer, a patriot, maybe a fool, definitely a scapegoat. It's a story that asks you to witness what justice looked like when pain was spectacle and law wore the mask of revenge. Because in 1302, there was no such thing as a humane execution. There were only choices: the wheel, the rope, the fire, and sometimes, if the court was feeling generous, a clean sword. But not for Simon. No, his death was meant to be remembered, meant to echo through the bones of every soul in Audomarois. They say the wheel broke him, then they tore him limb from limb. But this isn't just about death. This is about what a death can mean. When does punishment become politics? When does justice become theater? When does a man stop being a person and start being a warning? So ask yourself, if you were Simon, standing at the center of a square surrounded by faces you once knew, now twisted by fear or obedience, what would you be thinking? Would you scream? Would you beg? Or would you look the judge in the eye and say, do your worst? Tonight, we're peeling back the curtain on one of the darkest performances history ever staged. No makeup, no masks, just bones, blood, and betrayal. And before we step further into this tragic stage, hit that like button if your jaw's already dropped. Subscribe if you want more sleepless nights. And tell me, where are you listening from? And if you had to choose, burning at the stake, beheading, or the wheel, which one would you pick? Not easy, is it? Because this is just the beginning. Let's dim the lights and open the curtain. The stage is the town of Audomarois, 1302. The air smells of damp stone, livestock, and something more unsettling, anticipation. The wooden platforms creak under the boots of soldiers. Banners of the French crown flutter in a nervous wind, and right at the center of it all stands a man who was never meant to be a symbol until power needed one. Simon Hannabaert. Not a knight, not a noble. Just a farmer, but not just any farmer. A respected man in his village. A man whose voice carried weight in local matters. Some say he had charisma. Others called him dangerous, for having the gall to speak out when France began swallowing Flanders inch by bloody inch. Whether he was an organizer of rebellion, or merely a respected leader, is still debated by scholars, but to the crown, nuance was irrelevant. Simon became exactly what they needed, a body on which to write a warning. Now imagine you are Simon. Your hands are calloused from labor, your back strong from years of working the land. You've never worn silk, never held a sword, but you have something more powerful. Respect. People listen when you talk. So when French officials begin collecting taxes like wolves in sheepskin, and when the last crop of grain gets seized without apology, you open your mouth. And just like that, the noose begins tightening, first with suspicion, then with chains. Across from you, standing in the shadows of stone walls and velvet robes, are the agents of the French crown. Not cartoon villains, but cold administrators of a political machine. They don't see you. Not really. To them, you are no more than an example to set. Their names are lost to time, but their hands were steady. The judges, the guards, the clerk who wrote your sentence, they all played their parts. Some may have flinched. Most did not. It wasn't personal. It was policy. And the people... the people. The town you loved, the neighbors who once shared your table. They become a sea of faces that day in the square. Some of them whisper your name with grief. Some look away. Others shout, because shouting means surviving. If they cheer loud enough, maybe no one will question where their loyalty lies. Maybe they won't be next. In the corner, a child cries. Somewhere, a priest mutters a prayer neither of you believe will help. And then there's the executioner. Let's not pretend he's just a tool. He's a craftsman, in his own brutal way. Chosen for this role not only for his strength, but for his precision. He's done this before, many times. He knows exactly where to strike to snap the femur clean, how to swing without killing. He sees you not as Simon, but as a schedule. 9 blows, then the wheel, maybe a break for wine. Then the final act. Everyone on this stage plays their role, some willing, some not. But no one steps off it unchanged. This isn't just an execution, it's theater. And Simon, whether he wished it or not, is the star of the show. The tragedy lies not in his death alone, but in how many people it took to make that death happen. How many eyes had to look away, how many mouths had to stay shut, and how power, when dressed in robes and backed by fear, can twist a village into a jury, a crowd into accomplices. So, as the lights rise, as the hammer lifts, and the wheel waits, know this. The story of Simon Hannabaert is no ghost tale meant to chill the spine and fade. It is a memory. And like all memories, forged in fire and blood, it demands to be seen. It began quietly, as many tragedies do. In the early days of 1302, Audomarois was no different from any other Flemish town under the shadow of a foreign crown. The French monarchy, greedy and expanding, had tightened its grip on Flanders, strangling the region not with swords, but with taxes, regulations, and an ever-watchful eye. Simon Hannabaert, in his modest home surrounded by fields he had tilled for decades, felt the tension like the first tremor before an earthquake. Rumors moved faster than carts in the mud. Rumors of resistance, whispers of revolt. And in taverns thick with the smell of beer and smoke, people started talking about freedom. Not with fire, not yet, but with furrowed brows and clenched teeth. Simon wasn't a general, he wasn't a politician, but he was a man people trusted. He spoke with the authority of someone who had buried his ancestors in that soil. Someone who believed no crown should weigh heavier than the sweat of honest work. And that alone made him dangerous. One meeting too many, one word misheard, one name scribbled by a clerk trying to please a superior. It didn't matter how guilty he was. What mattered was that someone needed to pay. The French needed to remind the region of its place. Simon Hannabaert would do. They came for him before dawn. Always before dawn. Always when the fog was thick and the town still slept. His door broke before his eyes were fully open. No trial that mattered, no defense that would save him. The charges: sedition, treason, inciting rebellion. The punishment: to be broken on the wheel, then drawn and quartered. Not just death, a declaration. And so, on a morning heavy with the kind of silence that comes before screams, they dragged Simon through the streets. He didn't cry out. He didn't plead. Witnesses later said he looked straight ahead, as if trying to memorize the faces of those who looked away. The town square had been prepared, the wheel propped upright like a monument. Crowds gathered, because they always do. Not all wanted to be there. But absence could be as dangerous as sympathy. Better to stand and watch than to be marked next. The executioner stepped forward. Tall, anonymous, dressed in the dull leathers of function, not ceremony. He was not cruel, but he was precise. He tied Simon to the wheel, limbs stretched across its wide wooden spokes, and he raised the iron bar. The first blow landed on the shin. A crack echoed. A gasp rippled through the square. The second blow, higher. Then the arm, then the other leg. One by one, the bones broke, not in random chaos, but in deliberate order. Simon didn't scream at first. Shock is merciful that way, but pain always catches up. Some in the crowd wept, others prayed. A few looked away, but the executioner continued, rhythmic and measured. The sentence demanded that Simon remain alive for what came next. And so, when the last blow fell and his limbs dangled like snapped branches, they lifted the wheel upright and mounted it onto a post. There he hung, alive, barely twisted into a shape no man was meant to wear. But the wheel was only the opening act. They let him hang like that for hours, not to die, but to be seen. His blood painted the wood beneath him, a red halo of justice. Eventually, when his groans grew faint and the air began to buzz with flies, the executioners returned. This time with horses, 4 of them, each rope tied to a wrist or ankle, each rider waiting for the signal. The crowd, exhausted by horror, watched in near silence. And when the whip cracked, the horses ran. The sound of tearing was different this time. Less sharp, more wet. His body came apart, not like cloth, but like meat. It was over. But it wasn't, because Simon's death didn't quiet the whispers. It amplified them. What was meant to instill fear sparked something else. Rage, memory, defiance. His name began to appear on lips again, this time not as a warning, but as a prayer. They had tried to erase him with brutality. Instead, they carved him into the walls of history. And here we are, centuries later, still speaking his name, still telling his story. Not because he was a warrior or a saint, but because he was human. Because he stood in a place where silence was safety, and chose to speak. So sleep, if you can. But know that justice, once dressed in robes, often comes wielding a wheel. And sometimes, it's the silence of the crowd that hurts more than the hammer. Long after the square had been washed clean, and the flies had found new corners to haunt, whispers lingered. They always do. In back rooms, in kitchens where candles burned low, in the hush of nighttime prayer, people spoke Simon's name. But not in fear anymore, in fury. Because in time, as the adrenaline of fear faded and the blood on the cobblestones dried to a memory, something began to take shape. A realization. A sick, heavy truth that settled over the town like winter fog. Simon Hannabaert may not have been guilty. Not really. Maybe not at all. There had been no rebellion in Audomarois. No weapons cache. No secret meetings carved into parchment. Just a man who had been too respected to listen to. A man whose voice made other voices rise. And to the French authorities trying to choke dissent out of the region like weeds in their royal garden, that was enough. They didn't need a conspirator. They needed an example. And Simon, with his broad shoulders and weathered hands, looked perfect against a wheel. The betrayal ran deeper than the rope burns on his wrists. The men who ordered his death were not faceless tyrants from Paris. Some had once broken bread with him, shared wine, laughed with him under spring skies. They were locals, elevated by the French crown, handed robes and titles like favors at a masquerade. And they wore them well, didn't they? So well, in fact. They forgot whose hands had once helped raise their roofs, whose grain had once filled their bellies. When it came down to loyalty, they chose crowns over kin. But even that wasn't the twist that made blood boil in secret. No. The worst part was what happened after. The silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of policy. The French crown issued no statement. No acknowledgement of Simon's execution. It was not recorded as an act of heroism or necessity. It was simply not mentioned. His death was never intended to be history. It was supposed to vanish. But it didn't, because the dead don't stay quiet if the living remember. And remember they did. The very act meant to scare the region into submission had instead shaken it awake. The brutality had backfired. Resistance flared anew. Farmers, merchants, even low-ranking knights who had said nothing before, now found in Simon's fate a reason to raise their voices. The square where he died became a quiet place of pilgrimage. No flowers, no chants, just glances, long and heavy. Each one a vow that the crown's message had been received and rejected. There's something bitterly poetic in that. That in trying to erase a man, they carved him into stone. That in trying to make him disappear, they made him unforgettable. Simon's body was broken beyond repair. But his death had become an act of unintentional martyrdom. And his killers, they vanished into the fog of history. Their names forgotten, their titles dust. But Simon's name remains. In the end, the true betrayal wasn't the sentence. It wasn't even the execution. It was the belief that people could be silenced forever. That pain could overwrite memory, that a wheel and 4 horses could erase the truth. But truth, like bone, has a way of breaking free, no matter how tightly you try to bind it. So if you ever find yourself walking through an old town square, and the stones seem to echo with something more than footsteps, listen closely. Some places remember, some names don't fade, and sometimes the loudest legacy comes not from those who shouted, but from those who died trying to speak. And so the stage darkens, the crowd disperses, and the wheel, once drenched in purpose and blood, sits still, rotting slowly in some forgotten shed. The men who cheered, they went home. The men who judged, they were promoted or they went. History has always been foggy like that. But Simon, he stayed. In whispers, in eyes, in the hesitant steps, people took past the square long after it had been scrubbed clean. His was not the kind of death that fades. It was the kind that stains. Centuries later, you lie here listening. Warm, safe, untouched by fire or steel. You're not waiting to be judged by a king's puppet court. You're not tied to a wheel. You're not Simon. And yet you are. Because the truth is, history doesn't live in books or museums. It breathes in choices, in silence, in who we defend and who we let fall. Every time we flinch from injustice or scroll past cruelty because it's easier to look away, we step a little closer to the square, a little closer to the crowd. Simon's story doesn't ask for pity. It demands attention. It reminds us that power, when left unchecked, will always return to the wheel. That justice, when divorced from empathy becomes theater. That fear has a smell, and once you've breathed it in, it never really leaves your lungs. But it also offers something else. Something softer, stranger. A kind of accidental hope. Because even in a world that sharpened iron for men like Simon, his voice didn't die. They tried to break him so thoroughly, he'd disappear. And yet here you are, whispering his name into the dark, letting him live again in memory. That matters. So maybe that's the lesson. That its history isn't made by the crowns or the crowds, but by what survives them. That pain can echo into purpose. That silence can become a scream. That one man, nailed to a wheel centuries ago, can still reach across time and tap you gently on the shoulder. Maybe that's why we tell these stories before bed. Not just to shiver, not just to stare wide-eyed into the horrors of the past, but to remember what not to forget. To hold on to the thread of humanity woven even through the cruelest chapters. To feel the weight of history, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Because sleep will come. It always does. But as your eyes drift close tonight, let one final thought settle in your chest like a quiet drumbeat. In a world where they tried to make him vanish, Simon Hannabaert still exists. And maybe, just maybe, so does justice. Waiting, patient, unbroken.